A farmer inherited an old house made of sacks, which was the laughingstock of the whole neighborhood. The bank was pressuring him, and his neighbors advised him to tear it down as soon as possible. But he went inside anyway, and understood why his grandfather had remained silent all his life. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The mornings had begun to feel the same long before the letter arrived. Thomas Hale rose before the sun, not because he was disciplined or hopeful, but because the habit had outlived the reasons that once justified it. The farm woke reluctantly around him. The fields lay dull and flat under a low sky, the soil holding the cold of the night as if it resented being disturbed. The tractor coughed when he turned the key, the sound thin and tired, like an old man clearing his throat before speaking words he no longer believed in. Thomas listened to it with a familiar knot in his chest, counting the seconds it took to catch, calculating in silence how much longer it could last before it failed him for good. He worked alone. That, more than anything else, defined his days. The neighboring farms had long since consolidated, bought up by larger operations with new machines and smoother lines of credit. Thomas's land remained stubbornly small, stitched together from parcels his family had worked for generations, but now it felt less like an inheritance and more like a burden that required constant negotiation. Every repair was delayed, every purchase reconsidered. The margins had narrowed to the point where effort alone no longer guaranteed survival. Some nights, after balancing numbers that refused to settle into anything resembling hope, he wondered whether the land itself sensed his doubt and answered in kind. The bank reminded him regularly that sentiment did not count as equity. The letters were polite, always carefully phrased, but the meaning was clear. Time was running out. Thomas kept them in a drawer he rarely opened, as if ignoring them might slow their advance. He told himself that the next harvest would be better, that prices would rise, that something would change. These promises felt thin even as he made them, but they were all he had. The memory of his grandfather did not visit him often. When it did, it arrived without warmth. Elias Hale had been a difficult man to place even when he was alive, a presence on the edges of family gatherings, a figure spoken of in lowered voices or with dismissive shrugs. He had lived on the same land, but apart from it, choosing a strange, solitary existence that few understood, and even fewer respected. Thomas remembered him as tall and stooped, his movements deliberate, his eyes sharp in a way that made people uncomfortable. Elias spoke little, and when he did, it was never to explain himself. Over time, the family learned to stop asking. When the letter came, it felt less like news and more like an afterthought finally catching up to him. The envelope was plain, the handwriting precise. Thomas recognized the name of the county office immediately and felt a flicker of irritation before curiosity took hold. He opened it standing at the kitchen counter, the morning light spilling through the window and illuminating dust he had meant to clean for weeks. The words were formal, efficient. Elias Hale had passed. There were assets to be transferred. Thomas was named the sole heir. For a moment, Thomas felt nothing. The news seemed strangely abstract, as if it belonged to someone else's life. His grandfather had been absent in all the ways that mattered, and yet the idea that he was truly gone unsettled him. It was not grief that rose in Thomas's chest, but a dull sense of unease, the feeling that something unfinished had been set in motion. The meeting at the county office was brief. Papers were signed, dates confirmed, responsibilities outlined. Most of the land, it turned out, had already been accounted for, quietly absorbed into arrangements Elias had made years ago. What remained was a small parcel at the edge of Thomas's property, a piece of land few people remembered, and even fewer had reason to visit. And on it stood the house. Thomas had seen it before, of course. Everyone had. It was impossible not to notice once you knew where to look. The structure sat slightly apart from the main road, its shape uneven against the horizon. It had been built from dirt-filled sacks, stacked and sealed into walls that had aged into a mottled patchwork of earth tones. Time had darkened them, weathered them, given them an appearance that invited ridicule. Children had dared each other to touch it. Adults shook their heads and laughed. It was the sort of thing people pointed at when they wanted to explain what happened when a man lost his sense. The house had become a local joke long before Thomas was old enough to understand it. Even now, standing outside the county office with the paperwork in his hands, he could already hear the comments forming. He imagined the raised eyebrows, the sympathetic smiles, the thinly veiled amusement. Of all the things his grandfather could have left him, this was the one that felt almost intentional in its cruelty. When Thomas drove out to see it later that afternoon, the sky had turned a flat, unforgiving gray. The road narrowed as it approached the parcel, the land on either side growing rougher, less tended. The house emerged gradually, its outline resolving into the familiar, awkward form he had known from a distance. Up close, it looked worse. The sacks had sagged in places, the surface marked by years of wind and rain. The door sat low in the frame, its wood scarred and dull. Nothing about it suggested value. Nothing about it suggested hope. He sat in the truck for several minutes, engine idling, staring at the structure as if it might speak first. He felt a surge of anger then, sharp and unexpected. His grandfather had known the state of the farm. He had known the debts, the pressure, the way Thomas struggled to keep things afloat. And this was what he left behind. A joke, a burden, something else to explain away. Word traveled quickly, as it always did. By the next morning, Thomas's phone had begun to ring. Neighbors called under the guise of concern, their voices warm with curiosity. They asked what he planned to do with the house, whether he would tear it down, whether the county would even allow it to stand. Some laughed outright, unable or unwilling to hide their amusement. Others offered advice he had not asked for. The underlying message was the same. The house was an embarrassment, and so was the man who inherited it. At the bank, the reaction was colder. The loan officer glanced through the updated list of assets with practiced indifference. When his eyes landed on the additional parcel, his expression barely changed. He asked a few questions, all of them perfunctory. When Thomas explained what stood on the land, the man nodded once, then moved on. It was clear that whatever hope Thomas might have placed in the inheritance was misplaced. The house did not count. It could not be leveraged. It was, in every practical sense, worthless. That night, Thomas lay awake longer than usual. The familiar worries pressed in on him, but beneath them ran a new current, an irritation that refused to settle. He found himself thinking about his grandfather, not as a distant, inconvenient figure, but as a presence that still exerted influence. Elias had built that house deliberately. He had lived in it. He had chosen it. The thought unsettled Thomas more than he cared to admit. By morning, the decision had formed without ceremony. The house would be torn down. There was no sense in preserving a relic that only invited mockery. The land could be cleared, perhaps sold, perhaps folded back into the farm in some useful way. The sooner it was gone, the sooner Thomas could stop explaining it to people who had already decided what it meant. Still, habit or something like respect slowed his hand. Before calling in the equipment, before making arrangements, he decided he would go inside. It was a small concession, one he told himself was practical rather than sentimental. He needed to be sure there was nothing of value, nothing that required documentation or disposal. He owed that much to the process, if not to the man who had built the place. The key lay where it always had, tucked beneath a flat stone near the door. Thomas paused when he found it, struck by the familiarity of the gesture. He remembered his grandfather's hands, large and rough, setting things aside in predictable ways. The key was cool against his palm as he straightened, the house looming quietly in front of him. He hesitated before opening the door. The laughter of the neighbors, the disinterest of the bank, the weight of his own frustration pressed in on him all at once. This, he thought, was the last indignity. One final look at a life he did not understand, preserved in a structure no one had ever taken seriously. When he pushed the door inward, the hinges complained softly, and a breath of cool air escaped from within. Thomas stepped across the threshold, with no expectation beyond confirmation. He believed, with the certainty of a man who had been disappointed often enough to trust it, that he would find nothing there worth keeping. The air inside the house surprised him first. Thomas had expected dampness, the sour smell of rot, perhaps the stale breath of a place abandoned to mold and mice. Instead, what greeted him was dry and cool, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of earth warmed long ago by human presence. It was not unpleasant. It was not inviting either. It simply existed, steady and unchanged, as though the walls themselves had learned how to keep time at bay. He stood just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust. The light filtered in through two narrow windows, set low into the walls, their glass cloudy but intact. Dust hung in the air, but it was thin, settled rather than stirred, as if the room had been waiting patiently rather than decaying. The floor beneath his boots was packed earth, firm and level. Nothing shifted. Nothing creaked. The house did not announce his intrusion. It absorbed it. Thomas took a few careful steps forward. His boots left shallow prints that faded almost immediately, the soil compacting back into itself. He ran his hand along the nearest wall. The sacks were rough beneath his fingers, their fabric thickened by age, hardened where mud had long since fused into something closer to stone. He pressed gently, expecting gaive, weakness, some sign of the neglect everyone had assured him defined the place. There was none. The wall held. The interior was smaller than he had imagined, but not cramped. A narrow table stood against one wall, its surface scarred but clean. Shelves lined another, holding jars, tools, folded cloth, and stacks of notebooks, arranged with a care that felt deliberate. There was no chaos here, no sense of a man who had given up. Everything had a place. Everything had been put there by someone who expected to return. Thomas felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. He moved slowly now, his earlier irritation giving way to something closer to caution. He opened a jar at random and found dried beans, still sound. Another held nails, sorted by size. On the shelf above them lay a ledger, its spine cracked but sturdy. He picked it up and flipped through the pages. Dates filled the margins in a tight, consistent hand. Numbers followed, precise and unembellished. There were notes beside some entries, brief and factual. No explanations, no justifications. He set the book back where it belonged, unsettled by the realization that his grandfather hadn't lived here as an eccentric recluse, but as a man engaged in a long, methodical conversation with his own life. This house had been a workspace as much as a shelter. It had not been built to impress or defy. It had been built to function. The longer Thomas stayed inside, the harder it became to reconcile this reality with the stories he had grown up hearing. Elias Hale, the stubborn old man who refused help, who mocked modern conveniences, who chose dirt and sacks over lumber and nails. That was the version people liked to remember, because it made them comfortable. This version, revealed in quiet details and unspoken order, demanded more attention than anyone had been willing to give. At the back of the house, partially obscured by a stack of wooden crates, Thomas noticed a section of wall that looked different from the rest. The sacks there were darker, their surfaces smoother, as though they had been handled more often. He moved the crates aside, the sound of wood scraping softly against the packed floor. His fingers traced the outline of one sack, then another. They did not shift when he pushed. They were fixed in place. He hesitated. A rational voice in his head told him to stop, to remember why he was here, to finish his inspection and leave. Another part of him, quieter but more persistent, urged him on. He fetched a small pry bar from his truck and returned, kneeling in the dim light as he worked the edge of one sack free. It took longer than he expected. The material resisted him. The mud inside compacted into a dense mass that refused to crumble. When it finally gave way, it did so reluctantly, revealing not empty space, but the dull gleam of metal. Thomas froze. He widened the opening carefully, his breath shallow as he cleared away the remaining material. A small metal box emerged, its surface dulled by time but uncorroded. It was heavier than it looked. Thomas carried it to the table and set it down gently, as if sudden movement might cause it to vanish. He wiped the dust from the lid and stared at it for several seconds before lifting it open. Inside lay neatly stacked bills, bundled and labeled in his grandfather's handwriting. Years were written on the paper bands, not recent years, but decades past. The money smelled faintly of dust and ink, not decay. It was not a fortune, not in the way people imagined such things. It was careful, measured, intentional. Thomas closed the lid slowly. His first instinct was disbelief, followed closely by a surge of anxiety that made his hands tremble. This was not what he had expected to find. This was not what he was prepared to handle. He told himself it must be an anomaly, a one-time thing, perhaps a forgotten stash, or an old habit taken too far. He returned to the wall. By the time the sun had shifted enough to cast new shadows across the floor, Thomas had uncovered 3 more boxes. Each was similar in size and condition. Each contained money, organized with the same meticulous care. The dates told a story he did not yet understand, stretching across years in which Elias Hale had been dismissed as a man who had nothing to offer but odd opinions and stubborn silences. Thomas sat heavily in the lone chair, the boxes lined up before him like accusations. His thoughts raced, then stalled, circling the same questions without finding answers. Why here? Why hidden like this? Why no one knew? He remembered suddenly his grandfather's habit of watching rather than speaking. Elias would stand at the edge of gatherings, hands folded behind his back, eyes moving from face to face, as if measuring something invisible. Thomas had always assumed it was judgment. Now he wondered if it had been patience. The light inside the house dimmed as clouds gathered outside. Thomas stood and lit the small lantern he found on a hook by the door. Its glow filled the space with a warm, steady circle that softened the edges of the room. In its light, the house looked less strange, less laughable. It looked purposeful. He continued his search, no longer with the intention of confirming emptiness, but with the growing certainty that the house was anything but. Behind shelves, beneath floor coverings, within walls that had been sealed with more care than he had given them credit for, he found evidence of a life lived quietly and with intent. There were more ledgers, each filled with careful records. There were notes written in the margins, names he recognized, places he knew. Nothing was hidden without reason. Nothing was wasted. As evening settled in, Thomas realized he had lost track of time. The worry that usually gnawed at him had receded, replaced by a deeper, heavier unease. Whatever his grandfather had done here, whatever he had built within these walls, it was larger than Thomas had imagined. It was not a joke. It was not a mistake. He gathered the boxes he had opened and returned them to their places, resealing the wall as best he could. The act felt strangely reverent, as though he were closing a door that had not yet been meant for him. When he stepped back outside, the air felt colder, sharper. The house behind him stood silent, unchanged, its rough exterior betraying none of what it held. Thomas locked the door and slipped the key back beneath the stone. As he walked toward his truck, he glanced over his shoulder once more. The structure no longer looked ridiculous. It looked guarded, patient. He drove home with his mind still inside those walls, replaying the sight of the boxes, the order, the care. The decision to tear the house down no longer felt simple. It felt reckless. The irritation that had driven him there had been replaced by a question he could not ignore. What kind of man builds a house the world laughs at, then fills it with a life no one ever bothered to see? As night fell and Thomas lay awake once more, the farm around him settling into its uneasy rest, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. The house had not been empty, and whatever waited inside it was not done with him. Yet. Thomas returned to the house the next morning with a different posture than the day before. The irritation that had driven him there originally was gone, replaced by a cautious attentiveness that slowed his movements and sharpened his awareness. He locked the truck, not out of habit, but out of a sudden, unfamiliar instinct to protect something he could not yet name. The land around the house looked the same as it always had, rough and unassuming, but his perception of it had shifted. What had once seemed like wasted ground now felt deliberate, as though its very isolation had been chosen for reasons that were only beginning to surface. Inside, the house greeted him with the same quiet steadiness. The air had not changed overnight. The shelves stood as he had left them, the lantern still on its hook, the packed earth floor unmarked except for the faint traces of his own steps. Thomas paused again just inside the door, listening. There were no sounds beyond the distant wind and the low creak of the structure settling into the morning. The house was not hiding anything from him. It was waiting. He began methodically this time. He did not pry or force. He examined. He took notes of his own, jotting down what he found and where, the way his grandfather had done. It felt important to respect the order Elias had imposed, even as Thomas dismantled parts of it piece by piece. The ledgers came first. He sat at the table, lantern unlit in the growing daylight, and read through them slowly. They were not diaries. There were no reflections, no confessions, just dates, amounts, names, and occasional brief remarks. Loan for seed, advance for repairs, share purchased quietly, interest deferred. Thomas recognized the pattern only after several pages. These were not random transactions. They formed a network, a web of small, careful investments and assistance that stretched across decades. Elias Hale had moved through the local economy like a current beneath the surface, unseen but persistent. Some names jumped out at him immediately. Men who now owned large tracts of land, families who spoke openly about their success, about how hard they had worked to build something from nothing. Thomas remembered hearing these stories at auctions and community meetings, the way people nodded along, admiring the narrative of self-made prosperity. Now, in the margins of his grandfather's books, he saw the quieter beginnings of those stories, the moments when someone else had made survival possible. He closed one ledger and opened another. This one dealt with land, not the main parcels everyone knew about, but slivers and corners, pieces purchased when prices were low or when someone needed quick cash. Some were held directly in Elias's name. Others were listed under names Thomas did not recognize, with notes beside them that suggested informal arrangements. Trusted, temporary, will revert. The handwriting was steady, confident. Elias had not been guessing. He had been planning. The discovery unsettled Thomas more than the money had. Cash could be hidden, explained away, dismissed as paranoia or thrift taken too far. Land was different. Land required foresight. It required patience. It required an understanding of people and timing that Thomas had never associated with his grandfather. He began to see how Elias had been dismissed, not because he was foolish, but because he had refused to perform intelligence in a way others recognized. As the hours passed, Thomas moved deeper into the house, opening compartments he had missed the day before. Beneath a loose section of floor near the back wall, he found documents wrapped in oilcloth. They were older, their edges yellowed, but intact. These dealt with cooperative ventures, shared ownership in grain storage facilities, a milling operation that had since changed hands several times. Elias's name appeared only once, at the beginning, then vanished. The rest was handled through proxies, small percentages spread thin enough to escape notice. Thomas sat back on his heels, the weight of it pressing down on him. This was not hoarding. This was strategy. It was the accumulation of leverage without display, influence without authority. Elias Hale had positioned himself at the margins of everything that mattered and had stayed there, unseen, while others stepped into the light. The first confrontation came sooner than Thomas expected. He had taken one of the ledgers home with him, unable to leave it behind, and spent part of the evening cross-referencing names with his own records and memory. One name appeared again and again: Mark Benson. Benson owned 3 times as much land as Thomas did now. He was vocal about his success, generous with advice he assumed others needed. He had once joked openly about Elias Hale, calling him a relic who never understood how the world worked. The next morning, Thomas drove to Benson's farm. The meeting was awkward from the start. Benson greeted him with a wide smile that tightened when Thomas mentioned the ledger. The smile faded completely when Thomas laid the book open on the table between them. The handwriting was unmistakable. Benson stared at it for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from confusion to calculation. "That was old business," Benson said finally. "Things were different then." He spoke quickly, his words overlapping, explanations piling up before Thomas could respond. He claimed the debt had been settled long ago, that Elias had never asked for repayment, that there had been an understanding. When Thomas asked to see proof, Benson's voice hardened. There was none. Elias had not required it. The conversation ended without resolution. Benson did not threaten Thomas outright, but the message was clear enough. This would not be simple. What Elias had built quietly would now have to be claimed openly, and that openness invited resistance. By the end of the week, Thomas had encountered variations of the same reaction several times. Some people were genuinely startled, embarrassed to be confronted with a past they had allowed themselves to forget. Others were defensive, dismissive, even hostile. A few attempted to charm their way out of the situation, appealing to shared history and community ties. Thomas listened to them all, his understanding of his grandfather deepening with each encounter. Rumors began to circulate. Thomas heard them secondhand at first, then directly. People said Elias had been unstable, that he had manipulated others, that the records could not be trusted. Someone suggested Thomas was fabricating the claims, using his grandfather's death as an excuse to squeeze money from honest men. The words stung, but they also clarified something for him. This was what Elias had avoided. This noise. This scramble to control the story. Late one afternoon, back in the house, Thomas found himself standing in front of the wall, where he had first uncovered the boxes. He rested his forehead briefly against the cool surface, the weight of decisions pressing in on him. He could pursue everything through legal channels. The documents were strong enough. The money, the land, the shares could all be consolidated, enforced. He could recover far more than he needed to save the farm. But as he stood there, surrounded by evidence of his grandfather's careful restraint, the idea felt wrong. Elias had not demanded repayment because he could. He had waited because he did not need to. He had trusted time more than confrontation. That evening, as Thomas sorted through another stack of papers, he found a small envelope tucked into the back of a ledger. It was sealed, the paper thick and unmarked. Inside was a single sheet, folded once. There were no instructions on the outside. Only his grandfather's handwriting on the inside, spare and direct, addressed to no one in particular. Thomas read it once, then again, the words settling slowly. Elias did not explain the assets. He did not list them or justify them. He wrote instead about weight, about what it meant to carry something others did not see, about how easy it was to become loud when you finally had the right to be. The letter ended without advice, only a statement that felt more like a warning than a farewell. "If you choose noise," Elias had written, "it will answer you in kind." Thomas folded the letter carefully and placed it back where he had found it. The house around him seemed to absorb the moment, the walls holding not just earth, but intention. For the first time since the inheritance, Thomas felt something settle inside him. He did not yet know what he would do, but he understood now that the true difficulty lay not in claiming what his grandfather had left behind, but in deciding how to carry it without becoming the very thing Elias had spent his life avoiding. As night fell and Thomas locked the door behind him, the house stood unchanged in the darkness, its rough exterior betraying nothing of the quiet power it contained. The laughter that had once surrounded it felt distant now, almost irrelevant. What remained was a deeper challenge, one that could not be solved with force or haste. The assets his grandfather had left were real. So were the consequences of uncovering them. And Thomas knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that the hardest part was still ahead. The days that followed did not bring clarity so much as accumulation. Each morning, Thomas woke with the same sense of weight pressing against his chest, a heaviness that did not come from fear alone, but from responsibility. The discoveries he had made inside the house no longer felt like revelations. They had become obligations. Every name in the ledgers, every quiet note in the margins, every document wrapped carefully against time, now demanded an answer. The farm still needed tending. The field still required his hands. But his attention was split in a way it had never been before. He moved through his routines distracted, his thoughts returning again and again to the same question. What did his grandfather expect him to do with all of this? The pressure from outside intensified as quickly as the rumors spread. Thomas noticed the change first in small ways. Conversations that once began with weather and prices now opened with pauses, with looks that lingered too long. People who had waved from across a field now pretended not to see him. Others went out of their way to be friendly, their smiles stretched thin, their words chosen carefully. The knowledge that he possessed something of value, something once invisible, had shifted the balance between them. He had become an uncertainty in a place that preferred things fixed and familiar. Letters began to arrive. Some were formal, written by attorneys, whose names Thomas recognized from local disputes. They questioned the validity of documents, suggested misunderstandings, proposed meetings to clarify matters that felt deliberately vague. Others were handwritten, the tone almost pleading. Men who had never shown him particular kindness wrote about old times, about shared hardships, about how Elias Hale had helped them once when no one else would. They reminded Thomas of favors repaid in other ways, of work exchanged for money long forgotten. Each letter carried its own version of the same request. Let it go. Let it stay buried. Thomas read them all, then locked them away with the ledgers. He did not answer immediately. He found that he could not. Every response felt like a declaration, and he was not yet ready to declare himself anything. The legal complexities revealed themselves gradually, like cracks widening under pressure. Some of the land documents required confirmation from county records that had not been updated in years. Cooperative shares were tied up in entities that had merged, dissolved, reformed under new names. Sorting through them demanded time and money, both of which Thomas possessed only in limited supply. More troubling was the realization that pursuing these claims openly would place him in direct conflict with people who held influence in the community. Men like Benson did not lose ground quietly. Thomas sought advice from a lawyer in the nearest town, a woman whose reputation rested on her thoroughness rather than her charm. She listened without interruption as he laid out the facts, the documents, the history as he understood it. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied him with a careful expression. "You have a strong case," she said finally, "stronger than most. But strength comes at a cost." She did not elaborate because she did not need to. Thomas already understood. Winning would mean exposing truths people had benefited from forgetting. It would mean turning quiet arrangements into public records. It would mean noise. That word followed him home and lingered. Noise. It echoed in his thoughts as he returned to the house that had been built to contain the opposite of it. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it behind him with more care than usual. The interior felt unchanged, the same steady calm he had come to associate with his grandfather's presence. Thomas moved to the table and sat down heavily, the letter he had found earlier resting in his pocket like a stone. He took it out and unfolded it again, reading the familiar lines slowly. Elias had never written much, but the words he chose carried weight precisely because they were few. He did not mention money. He did not speak of fairness or justice. He wrote instead about restraint, about the difference between having the right to take and knowing when not to. He warned against the satisfaction of proving others wrong, against the temptation to turn quiet strength into spectacle. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to imagine his grandfather writing those words, his hand steady, his expression unreadable. Elias had known this moment would come. He had built toward it, prepared for it in his own way. The assets were not the inheritance. The test was. As the days passed, Thomas began to piece together the stories behind the numbers. He visited people not to demand repayment, but to listen. Some conversations were brief and guarded, others unexpectedly long. He learned of years when crops failed and banks refused loans, when Elias Hale had appeared without announcement and offered help without conditions. He had not spoken of interest or deadlines. He had simply asked to be remembered. For some, that memory had faded conveniently once prosperity returned. These encounters left Thomas conflicted. The law offered him a clear path. He could reclaim what was owed, consolidate the assets, secure his future decisively. The farm would be saved. His worries would end. Yet each time he imagined that outcome, he felt a tightening in his chest that did not ease. It felt like betrayal, not of others, but of the quiet logic that had guided his grandfather's life. The hostility grew sharper when it became clear that Thomas would not be easily swayed. At a community meeting, someone joked openly about the old dirt house, calling it a monument to madness. Laughter followed, louder than necessary. Thomas said nothing, but he saw the calculation behind the humor. They wanted him angry. They wanted him loud. That night, back in the house, Thomas found another set of papers he had overlooked before. They were tucked beneath a shelf, wrapped simply in cloth. These were not financial records. They were notes, brief observations written over the years. Elias had recorded moments rather than transactions. A family that would not have survived a winter without help. A man too proud to ask twice. A woman who paid back more than she owed without ever acknowledging the debt. The notes were not sentimental. They were factual, but together they painted a picture Thomas had never been shown. His grandfather had measured wealth not by accumulation, but by the ability to respond when others could not. Thomas understood then that the assets were not meant to be extracted like ore from the ground. They were meant to be carried, managed, used sparingly. Elias had positioned himself to help without spectacle, to intervene without control. He had trusted time and discretion more than contracts. The realization did not make Thomas's choice easier. If anything, it made it heavier. Acting as Elias had acted required patience. Thomas was not sure he possessed. It meant accepting loss where the law offered gain. It meant enduring whispers and doubts without the satisfaction of rebuttal. In the quiet of the house, Thomas felt the shape of the decision forming. He would not pursue everything. He would not turn his grandfather's life into a public accounting. He would reclaim enough to stabilize the farm, to breathe again, but no more than that. The rest he would handle as Elias had, through conversation rather than confrontation, through opportunity rather than demand. When he left the house that night, locking the door behind him, the weight he carried felt different. It was still heavy, but it no longer threatened to crush him. He understood now that money, when stripped of noise, demanded discipline rather than force. It asked not how much one could take, but how much one needed. The path ahead was uncertain and far from simple. There would be arguments. There would be losses. Not everyone would accept his approach. But as Thomas walked back toward his truck under the darkening sky, he felt aligned with something he had not known he was missing. The quiet strength his grandfather had practiced all his life was no longer hidden from him. And for the first time since the inheritance, Thomas felt prepared to carry it forward. The decision, once made, did not announce itself with relief. It settled slowly, like a change in weather that could be felt before it could be seen. Thomas did not wake up one morning suddenly confident or free of doubt. What he felt instead was a narrowing of options, a sense that the path ahead, though difficult, had become singular. There would be no dramatic confrontations, no sweeping claims made in courtrooms or newspapers. He would move forward quietly, deliberately, as his grandfather had done, and accept whatever consequences that choice carried. The first task was unavoidable. The farm itself had to be secured. Without that, everything else was theory. Thomas returned to the lawyer with a revised approach, one that surprised her. He asked not how to claim everything, but how to disentangle just enough. They worked through the ledgers together, identifying assets that could be converted without igniting open conflict. Old cooperative shares that had matured quietly. Parcels of land whose ownership could be clarified without dragging neighbors into disputes. It was slower work than a full legal push would have been, but it was steadier, and it left fewer scars. The money that emerged from this process did not arrive all at once. It came in increments, through transactions that felt almost anticlimactic after months of tension. Thomas resisted the urge to celebrate each step. He treated the funds not as a windfall, but as deferred labor finally paid. The debts that had loomed over him for years began to recede. One by one, he closed accounts that had haunted his sleep. The bank letters stopped arriving. The loan officer's tone changed from cautious to respectful, though no apologies were offered. Thomas did not expect them. With the pressure eased, he turned his attention fully back to the land. The work felt different now. Not easier, but cleaner. He repaired the tractor rather than coaxing it through another season. He replaced worn equipment instead of patching it together yet again. The fields responded in their own time, the soil benefiting from care it had been denied for too long. Thomas worked harder than he had in years, but the exhaustion carried a sense of purpose he had almost forgotten. Word spread quickly, as it always did. People noticed the changes. They saw new machinery, improved fences, the steady rhythm of a farm no longer operating on the edge of collapse. Some assumed Thomas had pursued the assets aggressively after all. Others suspected outside investment. Few asked directly. Those who did received simple answers. The farm was stable again. That was all he said. The harder part came when he began dealing with people, not as creditors or adversaries, but as participants. Thomas did not forgive debts in the dramatic sense people expected. He did not call meetings to announce generosity. Instead, he approached individuals quietly, much as his grandfather had. He offered work where there had once been obligation. He proposed shared ventures where repayment had been owed. In doing so, he shifted the terms without erasing the past. Some rejected the offers outright. Pride, fear, or resentment closed doors Thomas did not try to force open. Others accepted cautiously, suspicious of his motives. Over time, a few began to understand that this was not charity. It was continuity. The same quiet system Elias Hale had used to keep people afloat was being restored, not expanded or corrected, simply continued. The house became central to this process, without Thomas planning it that way. He found himself returning there often, sometimes for practical reasons, sometimes simply to think. The structure no longer embarrassed him. Its rough walls and low doorway felt grounding, a reminder of scale and restraint. He began using the table inside as a place for conversation, for agreements made without paper or spectacle. People who entered it often did so reluctantly at first, expecting mockery or discomfort. They left changed, unsettled by the realization that what they had dismissed for years possessed a solidity they had overlooked. Thomas never renovated the house. He fixed what was necessary to keep it standing, nothing more. The walls remained uneven. The sacks remained visible. He resisted every suggestion to improve its appearance, to make it more presentable. To do so, he felt, would be to misunderstand it. The house was not meant to impress. It was meant to endure. As the seasons turned, the farm's recovery became undeniable. Crops stabilized, storage filled. Thomas reinvested carefully, never all at once, never in ways that would draw attention. He became known not for sudden success, but for consistency. People came to him with proposals, some genuine, some opportunistic. He learned to listen without committing, a skill his grandfather had clearly mastered long before him. Through it all, Thomas felt himself changing. The anger that had once simmered beneath his exhaustion faded. In its place grew a steadiness that surprised him. He no longer measured his progress against others, or against the expectations that had once weighed so heavily on him. He measured it against the quiet standard he had inherited, the unspoken question of whether his actions created noise or stability. One evening, after a long day in the fields, Thomas returned to the house alone. The light was low, the air cool. He sat at the table and opened one of the ledgers he had not yet returned to its place. He read entries he now understood more fully, tracing patterns that mirrored his own choices. Elias had never sought balance in the sense of equality. He had sought balance in timing, in knowing when to hold and when to release. Thomas closed the book and leaned back, listening to the silence. He realized then that he was no longer afraid of the assets he had inherited. They no longer felt like a test he might fail, but like tools he was learning to use. The farm was no longer merely surviving. It was becoming something deliberate again, shaped by choices rather than desperation. Outside, the land stretched quietly into the distance, unchanged in appearance, but altered in meaning. Thomas knew there would still be losses. Not every effort would succeed. Not every relationship could be repaired. But he also knew that he had stepped fully into the inheritance his grandfather had intended, one that extended beyond money and land into a way of moving through the world. When he locked the house and walked back toward the lights of the farm, Thomas felt no triumph. What he felt instead was continuity. The work was ongoing. The structure held. And for the first time, he understood that rebuilding did not require revenge, only patience and the willingness to remain quiet when silence was enough. By the time the second full year turned since Thomas Hale had first unlocked the door of the Earthbag house, the land no longer felt like a battlefield. The farm moved with a rhythm that had been absent for so long that Thomas sometimes caught himself pausing in the middle of a task, unsettled by the quiet ease of it. There were still problems, still days when machinery failed or weather threatened to undo weeks of work. But the constant edge of collapse was gone. The farm no longer existed from season to season. It existed forward. Thomas had become careful with numbers, but he was no longer afraid of them. The ledgers that once represented danger and obligation now rested where his grandfather had kept them, inside the house, returned to their shelves after serving their purpose. He had extracted what was needed, and no more. Enough to secure the land, restore the equipment, rebuild the foundation of his work. Enough to become a man of means, but not a man changed beyond recognition. People spoke of his success now, though never with the same sharp amusement they once used when they mentioned the house. The tone had shifted. It carried a kind of uncertainty, even restraint. Some said Thomas had been lucky. Others said he had been clever. A few said nothing at all, which he understood to be the highest form of acknowledgement they were capable of offering. He did not correct any of them. He had learned that explanations rarely improved understanding. He was a millionaire by any reasonable measure, though the word itself felt foreign to him. The money existed mostly on paper and in property, circulating through the farm and the small network of people who now depended on its stability. Thomas did not move, did not build a new house, did not alter his routines in ways that would invite attention. He lived much as he always had, rising early, working until his body demanded rest, listening more than he spoke. The difference lay not in what he owned, but in what he no longer feared losing. The house remained exactly where it had always been. From the road, it still looked the same. Uneven walls, darkened sacks, a shape that resisted conventional judgment. Newcomers to the area sometimes asked about it, assuming it was abandoned or awaiting demolition. Those who had lived there long enough answered differently now. They said it was Thomas Hale's house, though everyone knew he did not live in it. They said it had belonged to his grandfather. They said it was important, and when pressed, they could not always explain why. Thomas visited it less often than before, but never stopped entirely. Some evenings he sat inside alone, the lantern casting its steady circle of light, the packed earth floor cool beneath his boots. Other times, people came to him there, not for loans or forgiveness, but for conversation. The house had become a place where matters were discussed quietly and without witnesses, where agreements were reached without pressure. Thomas did not encourage this reputation, but he did not refuse it either. He understood now that places, like people, acquired meaning through use rather than intention. The neighbors he had helped no longer spoke of gratitude. That, too, was intentional. Thomas had structured every arrangement to avoid the language of charity. Work was exchanged for opportunity. Participation replaced debt. Those who succeeded did so publicly, on their own terms. Those who failed did so without humiliation. This balance mattered to him more than profit. It was the difference between power and stewardship, a distinction his grandfather had understood instinctively. Only once did Thomas seriously consider altering the house. A contractor passing through the area suggested reinforcing the walls, smoothing the exterior, perhaps adding a proper foundation. It would preserve the structure, the man said, protect it from time. Thomas listened politely, then declined. Protection was not the point. The house had stood long enough to prove what it needed to prove. Changing it now would turn it into something else, something that belonged more to explanation than memory. As the years settled, Thomas found himself thinking about Elias Hale less as a puzzle and more as a presence that had never fully left. He understood now why his grandfather had lived as he did, why he had accepted ridicule and misunderstanding without defense. Elias had not been indifferent to opinion. He had simply valued outcome over reputation. The house had been both shield and test, filtering out those unwilling to look beyond appearances. On a quiet autumn evening, Thomas returned to the house alone, carrying nothing with him but the key. The fields lay harvested and bare, the air sharp with the promise of winter. Inside, the house felt exactly as it always had, unchanged by time or circumstance. Thomas moved through it slowly, touching the shelves, the table, the walls. He stopped at the section of wall where he had first uncovered the boxes, his fingers resting lightly against the surface. He did not open it again. There was nothing left to retrieve. What had mattered had already been taken, not from the wall, but from the life that had built it. Thomas understood now that the house was never meant to be emptied. It was meant to remain whole, a quiet witness to choices made without applause. When he stepped outside, the sky had darkened, the first stars emerging above the land. He locked the door and replaced the key beneath the stone, the familiar gesture carrying no superstition now, only continuity. The house stood behind him, unchanged, unremarkable to those who did not know its story. Thomas walked back toward the lights of the farm, his steps unhurried. He no longer needed the house to guide him, but he knew it would remain, steady and patient, long after others forgot why it had been built. Some structures endured because they were strong. Others endured because they were honest. This one endured because it had taught a man how to carry wealth without noise, how to help without humiliation, how to stand without needing to be seen. And so the house remained standing, not as a monument to poverty or eccentricity, but as proof that the most valuable inheritances often look like nothing at all until the moment someone finally learns how to see them. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Watch our other stories. Each one continues the conversation in a different way. And if this video meant something to you, share it with someone who should see it too.